Welcome to Minerva, a monthly show where we discuss the mysteries. We hope to give you enough information that you can go away and do your own study. Now, because of COVID-19, we're back at home filming again for you, but we wanted to bring you an episode on sacred geometry. Sacred geometry implies that there is an intelligence behind geometric shapes, structures and the placement of things. Now, this is often used to explain the workings of the universe using different shapes like spirals and circles, etc., etc. And it's heavily prevalent in the Indian culture. But we're not going to discuss that. Today we're going to discuss sacred geometry as it would be seen in your esoteric bookshop. If you go into an esoteric bookshop, there's been lots of different books saying different things about objects and buildings placed in certain ways to give some kind of divine agenda or some kind of hidden meaning. Now, the word has changed over the years, and we really wanted to discuss those changes and places on the map and around the globe that have been attributed to having sacred geometry. Now, I'd like to introduce my co-host Duncan. Duncan, what are your thoughts?
This stuff has vexed me for years. But you're quite right. It's my issue has not been really accepting this cultural change in the phrase. To me, it does go back to what it originally meant, which is stuff that was like set down by Plato, which was you studied geometry under the seven liberal arts to draw something perfectly using perfect geometry. And if you could see in nature, whether it be a plant or the stars moving, you could see this geometry being seen as being perfect. You're seeing the evidence of divine creation because that's where the intellect is behind it. But that geometry had to be perfect, hence it being sacred. And so, of course, when these pages and books started coming in of saying, look, there's this star of 5 points that's roughly drawn on this hillside. And people said, this is sacred geometry. And they go, well, actually, no, it's not. If it was perfect, then that's sacred geometry because you're seeing something that's divine. But when it just happens to be a star-like shape on a hillside, no, it's not. So I understand that, through this topic, we are talking about the latter interpretation rather than the former. But, it's not something I'm chuffed about. Sorry, bud.
Let's talk about specifics. We both love the mystery of Renne Le Chateau. And for me, that's a treasure story. We've spoken about it in previous episodes. And it is all born from those dossiers secrets that were the Parisian documents left in the National Library in France. And when you look at the books that have been produced by Henry Lincoln and other people in that field, they often discuss this pentagram. Now, the pentagram is said to be within the landscape of Renne Le Chateau in and around that area. And actually, if we look back at some of the old Pierre Plantard interviews, he even mentions the kind of area as a general idea, which builds that mysticism. However, if you were to go along to Henry Lincoln, or if you were to buy The Holy Place, one of his famous books, you'll see in there that he's drawn this pentagram on the landscape over a map. And that map has 5 points, but the points are all different. There's 2 churches, 2 hillsides, and then Renne Le Chateau. Now, I appreciate that the pentagram looks pretty solid and some of the angular mathematics are exciting if you read along with the script that Henry puts out there. However, for me, if this was going to be something completely sacred, like you say, I think it would have to be perfect. It wouldn't necessarily just be a random church, a random hillside, a town, etc., etc. It would all be 5 unique points that are only there and there's nothing else around them. When you read further into this theory, people start adding other churches across lines that divide some of the pentagram, etc., etc. And then you bring in the meridian line and you bring in all of these other things, and then other objects start appearing around this map. And to me, that takes away from the whole idea of it being sacred geometry. It's supposed to be perfect. It's supposed to be something really finite and basically intelligent design. Now, I appreciate that's not everybody's own thoughts, but it is mine. And for me, one of the real funny aspects of this is a friend of ours, Stephen, always talks about hearing and seeing these tourists run up to Henry Lincoln at Rennes Le Chateau with their maps and saying, Henry, please draw your pentagram on the map. And he'll pull out a massive thick marker and draw it. And Stephen always says that the reason for the thick marker is because it doesn't quite line up as it should. And using a thick marker kind of makes the lines a bit thicker and makes things fit a bit better. And I feel when you're doing that, it's really, escaping the point of this being sacred geometry. So for me, it's not there in Rennes Le Chateau. But what about you, Duncan? What's your thoughts?
Oh, well, you know my opinion on this. As I've just said, it's pentagrams on hillsides. It doesn't ring true in any aspects. One is as we're talking about the actual terming of the phrase sacred geometry, if you're looking at as the sense of the classical phrase. And if it is something that's meant to have been built thousands of years ago, then it would have been the classical studies. They would have known it had to be perfect. But the thing that really annoys me with this is the case of, bless his heart for Henry Lincoln, and kudos to him for raising, as you say, we both love the Renne Le Chateau mystery. And if it wasn't for his part in it, as well as other players, we wouldn't know about the subject. But yeah, it's about a treasure hunt. It's about a priest who suddenly got into loads of wealth. I know there's all other bits added to it, but the only thing that's tangible is this priest and what he spent his money on. And I cannot see how we get from a priest earning money to a massive pentagram in the hillsides around. I mean, who'd pay money for that? Except for people willing to buy a book about this kind of geometry. It's just not there for me. But I mean, it's not the only pentagram that's in the story, though, is it? I mean, we've also got the famous pentagram, so commonly written about, again, with Renne Le Chateau, that's in the Shepherds of Arcadia, which I'm still surprised people are still using as a point of research or a point of fact, as it were, due to the fact, yes, when it came out, okay, it kind of fit, and there was a professor who said it, but after scrutiny, it doesn't make any sense. One aspect is a sense of, we now know from the records of the Louvre that the painting itself has changed sizes several times. It's got smaller, it's got larger, and that was something that happened to art. So Poussin would have known that his painting would have changed sizes. And so to include a pentagram-like design, which actually requires the framework of the painting to be included in that, a major part of it included, knowing that's going to change, makes the whole thing pointless. Not only that, we know of all the other obscurities in the painting, like there's the cream shepherd's staff, it's broken halfway, we know that's important. There's another staff that has a hardened line on it, which makes it look like it was importantly set. Neither of those are actually used in the geometry that about the pentagram, which is a shame, because this is the most geometrically precise. It's not perfect, but the most geometrically precise one we have relevant to Renne Le Chateau, but it makes no sense. I mean, when someone pulls up these things and says, "Oh, look, that definitely because that follows that curvature in the cloth," that one always makes me laugh. It's because, well, what makes that curvature more important than that curvature over there? It's the same as choosing one church over another just to make the geometry fit, rather than, okay, if we're meant to find this, then these would be specific points in the painting, not just an odd curve here and that slight dint in the hillside there. No, it's not there. But then again, this isn't the only sort of like pentagram thing we're looking at around the world, is it? I mean, you've got a better one from America, haven't you?
Yeah, so if we nip across the pond, so to speak, and look at Washington, D.C., conspiracy theorists will tell you that there is a pentagram and lots of Masonic symbols within the framework of the city. Now, we have to go back here to understand how this happened. Washington, D.C. is a new city, and it was built from the ground up. It was commissioned by George Washington, who was one of the founding fathers of America, but he was a Freemason, and we know that to be the case. He commissioned a gentleman called L'Enfant, who was an architect and designer, a French guy. And when we look back at the research, there's been a toing and throwing over the years about whether L'Enfant was actually a Freemason. Now, there seems to now be strong evidence that he was a Freemason. He was a member of Holland Lodge number 8 from New York. And I believe, personally, that he might have put some of his ideas and his Masonic knowledge within his designs. Now, in my day job, I'm a designer, and you take influence from everywhere, certainly from things like Freemasonry, which take up a large part of your life. So there's no reason to believe that he wouldn't look at certain ways of doing things, certain symbols and certain things he likes, and actually start putting those within his designs. However, I don't think that makes it divine in any way. I just think that makes it something that he's doing, something that he's a part of him. And a lot of times these are kind of in-jokes. You can almost imagine him turning up with the plans for the city and presenting them to George Washington, and then kind of quietly whispering in his ear as though nobody else is listening, saying, and also if you look down at Fifth Avenue, there might be something there that you notice. And, of course there's something in there. So often people, designers and architects, etc., will put kind of small in-jokes and little nods to other things within their design. However, I just don't think it makes it sacred geometry. I think it makes it just something that is part of him and part of his kind of research. How about you? Do you think that there's any kind of theory here that works?
Oh, any theory that works. Yeah, no, I like this. I like this subject. When we're talking about Washington, again, because now we're trying to do more on my familiar territory our familiar territory of Freemasonry. To deal with the first part. Do I actually feel that there's the actual, that sort of geometry actually in the layout of Washington? I'd have to say no. Again, it goes back to, we do have a clean slate here, is a brand new capital being commissioned. I think where you have all the roads leading into certain points and the checkered nature of it, I think they were going for something that was modern, that was practical. It was the shortest distances from other places. And then they've got apexes which are drawing people in. I think it's a beautiful point of what would then have been very modern architecture. But saying that, I'm not a great one to stand on the Masonic bandwagon of the founding fathers. I think it's sometimes I think that is overplayed. But what is beautifully tantalizing to think, and I think it's quite important or quite enigmatic to think, is when the first stone was laid, when the ceremony was there, and George Washington was laying the first stone for the Capitol, which actually, strange enough, nobody knows where it is now. It's disappeared. They don't know where the actual first laid stone actually was. But when George Washington did it, he did the ceremony in Masonic regalia. Now, most Masons today, we see Freemasonry as an enjoyable hobby. It's something that we enjoy. It can take up a lot of our time. We like it to influence our lives, but it's pretty much a private thing. But this is the President of America setting the Capitol, bringing in Freemasonry as a formal part of that ceremony. I find that astounding. I love that idea. So we cannot rule out the concept that this laying of the stone, an architectural element is there to actually to be Masonic in some way. And Freemasonry, especially at this period of time, was heavily about geometry. The reason I say that, maybe I've overstressed it a little, but I've already mentioned we talk about the 7 liberal arts and sciences. And in Freemasonry, it comes up as a recurring theme. A lot of modern Masons just see it as a line in the script, but classically, it's been there from the beginning about learning the civil arts. Now, at the moment, we mention the civil arts in our modern ceremonies, but back then, and only remains in a few of the oldest rituals that exist, still practiced in England. Not only do we say we study the 7 liberal arts, but they were taught you must study geometry. Geometry is the most important one to study. So when Washington was commissioning the city and this idea of geometry being set, it would have been very much a Masonic idea to do it. And although we can't see it or I can't see it really in the layout of Washington, D.C., we can see it happen actually in England. There was same sort of time. We're looking at between like 1740, 1750. This is a time when Masonic rituals had really moved from quite a basic level from it's like 1720, the Premier Lodge of England. We're now getting more of a flair in there. And at this time, there was an architect by the name of John Woods, very famous. He pretty much started what was the Georgian field to architecture. But when he was in Bath, for one of his examples, he was commissioned to build some very stately things around there. But one of the big things was he built the Circus. If you've ever been to Bath, go there. It's a beautiful, like a roundabout of tall Georgian houses and perfect circle. It's beautiful. And there's a line of detail that goes around with all these beautiful symbols on. Some Masonic, some classical. But also, just down the road, he built another, which was, instead of being a circle, is a square. Now, I won't say about the relationship between the two. I'll leave it for people to discover for themselves. But there's a relationship in scale between the circle and the square. And there's a road that goes between them. Now, architecturally, you'd imagine you have the circle and you'd have the road go straight down into the square. But it doesn't. It goes into the corner of the square along one side. So that when you actually see it, if you look at it from above, it's a perfect key. You have the circle, you have the shaft of the key, and you have the square, the part at the end. Now, again, in our modern rituals, you don't hear the key. It's only in the very old rituals that you hear a reference to the key. And if you look at old designs of our tracing boards, you can still see it. It's a little key that's hanging off the ladder. And it was an important line. And what it symbolized was something, again, it would be incorrect for me to actually say what it symbolized. But what it was so quintessential to Freemasonry. It seems, like you say, the in-joke or the homage to Freemasonry is beautifully put in this architectural design in Bath. So we can see where geometry, classical architecture can be brought together and done. And there's a wonderful example of it.
Well, moving down south from Bath into London, there's another example. Conspiracy theorists will tell you that Hawksmoor churches also form a pentagram. Now, if you don't know who Hawksmoor was, Nicholas Hawksmoor worked under Christopher Wren, another very famous architect who built St Paul's Cathedral and lots of other buildings. Now, both of these gentlemen were Freemasons and actually quite heavily involved in Freemasonry. Hawksmoor went on to design 6 churches in London. Now, what's interesting about these churches is that they're very different to the norm. They have things like obelisks and pyramids. They have pillars which are adorned in just different ways to what you would expect from a normal church. Now, there is a theory behind this, and that theory is psychogeography. Now, that is the effect of these buildings on people's psyche, on people's feelings, their emotions, and the way that they act. And people believe that the way that these churches are placed gives people different feelings and different energies and makes them, react in really strange ways. Now, there's a great book on this called Lud Heat, and it tells that story, and it's got excerpts from Aleister Crowley in it where they talk about Jack the Ripper and those murders all being within the pentagram of these Hawksmoor churches. It's all very exciting stuff. There's also another book called From Hell, which again leans on that story of Jack the Ripper, but this is a graphic novel. Now, being a graphic novel, it's got some beautiful drawings in it, and you can really follow the story. However, when you look at the pentagram, it's perfect. It looks great in the novel. However, when you look at the pentagram in real life, it's very stretched. It almost doesn't fit perfectly at all. And again, we go back to this thing of design. We go back to this thing of intention. To me, it just doesn't feel like it was built for purpose. I do think that these two Freemasons had the ability to build some beautifully symbolic buildings, but I just don't know if they were putting any kind of energies or any other divine thought into their grand designs when they were putting these together. What do you think, Duncan? Have you got any theories on the London stuff?
Oh, yeah. So much to say about this subject, different ways. Firstly, going on to your early comment about religious buildings, like churches being specifically designed geometrically to both induce an emotion and also to convey a message, was one of the primary aspects of Gothic design. I mean, the pointed doorways you have on a Gothic church are to represent the Vescopisca, because if you look at a Gothic church, you'll always see that where that line of the doorway goes up, that will always go to a feature. That will be a perfect circle over that side. And that side then will go to another perfect feature over there. And the idea was one circle represented heaven, the other circle represented earth. And then the Vesca Pisca was meant to be represent Jesus. So the idea of when you go into the church, you literally were going, the only way you can get from heaven to earth is through the only doorway, which is Christ. And so that's why you have that pointed doorway, which is also when you went into the Gothic churches, the idea of having the stained glass windows going up was to have that splash of incredible colour, in the sense that would have been a unique experience back then. It's almost like the LED lighting of a disco we'd see now. But if you were seeing that and that volume of space above, it was again to create this emotion of you're actually entering heaven. And the only way you got there was through the Vesca Pisca. So this idea of geometry and sacred places is very intent on this subject, which then brings us on to Hawksmoor. And strange enough, my introduction to Hawksmoor was through a novel. I don't normally read novels, but a friend of mine said, "Look, you got to read this," and I read it. Read it, guys. If you ever got a chance to read it, it's just a novel. Hawksmoor by Peter Ackroyd. He's actually a historian, but he writes his books as well. And it was brilliant. But the great thing is, I didn't know, even then, I didn't know who Hawksmoor was. Again, I thought it was a fictional character. And he wrote so well that it wasn't until like 5 or 10 years later, the name came up and then other bits came up. So, that was all in that book. Do read it. I won't give the plot away. Brilliant book. But on Hawksmoor himself, this was an incredible guy. Apprentices Christopher Wren surpassed him in his skills. And he definitely had the classical attraction. He never went on the Grand Tour, which was the case of where the great intellects would have gone around Europe to see classical architecture to bring it back. He did it purely from study. But I have to agree, when you're actually looking at this, the churches that were built, because we're looking at a time where the plague had just finished. There was a Great Fire of London. There was so much damage. Some places could be reclaimed and redone. Others were just being, okay, let's make this better. But it's not specific places. But we do have to say that there is one mystery, though, and that is with, I think it's at the St. Anne's Church. I could be wrong, but there's one where you have the church, all nice, but in the grounds, left there by Hawksmoor, is this pyramid. It's quite a tight-knit pyramid. There's no inscription on it. It's big. Anyway, it's not huge. I suppose it was about 4 foot. It's heavy. But it's there and nobody knows why. There's no feature. It's not like an entrance to a pathway. And so it's a mystery. But that's the great thing. If you can say it that way and it sounds very tantalizing, it feels like there's something to look into, and there might be. But one of the theories about it that makes me smile is the case of someone's noticed that 2 of the spires around the back of the church have the same pyramid. And so they just speculated, well, maybe just by accident, they ordered 3 when they only needed 2. And no one could be bothered to take the one back to the stone merchant because he's never going to use it anymore. They've already paid for it. Well, they just left it in situ. Could we just build as rubble, just been left there? But it goes to that point that that seems to be the only mystery. That again, the sacred geometry of a beautiful placed out pentagram in London, afraid doesn't seem to be there. It's a different subject. Sorry, Dan.
Well, for once we seem to agree. I think this subject is really fascinating. I've enjoyed going over some of these topics and looking back over my old work and research. However, I still kind of come to that same conclusion that I don't believe that people are doing this for any kind of hidden agenda. There's another small topic which we haven't touched on, which is ley lines. And we'll leave that for another episode, I think. But just to broadly talk about them in the same sense, I believe the same type of thing happens. When people see these ley lines and energy lines, etc., they're more entitled to put things on them or around them because they become ancient routes and they become roads and they become walkways and they become places for people to congregate. So it just seems more natural that things start to build along them. And we see that with St. Michael's ley line in England, which is another really fascinating subject, which we can probably talk about another time. One other thing that I think is really worth mentioning just in my final thoughts is the work of a guy called Court Lindell. Now, Court's a fan of the show and has always helped us with our research. And he does some great stuff on ancient geometry and looking at sacred geometry around the world. He's often plotting buildings all across the globe and showing their relationships to each other, the way they face. And I think there's something in that. I think churches and Masonic temples and people looking to the East, etc., has again some tones of this wanting to have a divine nature within what we're building. However, I've always kind of struggled with that notion, but I do think it's worth going and looking at Court's research and looking at his videos and seeing what you think. And again, I'm really interested to see what people in our comments talk about. If you know of any others that we haven't brought up, are there any glowing examples of sacred geometry which we've missed? Are there any other examples which we can then do other episodes on? Would be really great to know. However, I do kind of feel that it's, for once we're kind of on the same page, Duncan. What kind of personal notes have you got to end?
Yeah, we agree on so much of this, which is almost a shame, really. But notes. Well, first thing it says, when you're asking for comments, one thing I just remembered was going back to the Washington thing. Maybe one of the viewers can remember. I remember reading it somewhere that there was a pillar. I don't know if it was an Egyptian pillar. I've got a feeling it was in Washington. But when it was moved, underneath was found some Masonic working tools. I know it could have been any tools, but apparently they were placed quite ceremonial. So I believe it was a trowel, a set square, and a compass. I could be wrong, but if anyone else has read that somewhere, let us know. I'll be interested. But on the closing thoughts, I think, to be honest, it echoes what I was saying at the beginning, what you were saying. We're looking at a defining difference between two aspects. There is sacred geometry in the sense of when we're looking at the liberal arts, when we're looking at Plato setting the scene of turning around and saying, if you are to study creation, if you are looking for God in existence or the order before chaos, the order after chaos, you'll need your straight edge, your pencil and your compass. And that passion for drawing perfection and looking for perfection is an academic, it is a classical study. I'd suggest people to look up the Sun Club, an organisation that was running in the late 1600s, early 1700s. They were just devoted to this concept of classical study. That's one thing, and I understand that we have that term for sacred geometry. I have to accept that there is this other side, but I'm not going to accept this. I'm sorry, I can't accept these hillside geometry, but I'm referring to the sense of where, apologies for workers in the world for me getting this wrong, but it's the impression for me. But I can appreciate if someone uses a crude geometric shape, like just drawing in sand a pentagram on the floor, that it has for them an intrinsic value. It becomes a sacred symbol, and it happens to be geometric. I can accept that being sacred geometry for that grounds, and so I have no problem with that, and I hope no offence has been taken in if that's been skipped in what we've discussed. The sacred geometry I can't accept is when we are looking at hillsides or ley lines or ley lines, another subject, but obscure geometric designs in paintings that go off tangent, and we're looking at random things in the painting, like one curve when you've got another curve on the other side. It makes no sense to me. That's neither sacred or divine in any sense. So if we clarify the two that do exist, which is the ones I say, if somebody finds an intrinsic value because of a spiritual nature, like drawing a pentagram on the floor, and then there's the academic side, which is that sacred geometry. I can now accept that those two terms exist. Beyond that, I'm sorry, not for me.
Well, it's been a strange episode, really, because, for once we are actually agreeing. However, I really hope that our next episode will be filmed properly. We'll be out of lockdown, so to speak, and we'll be able to meet in person and bring you some more content. Please do like and subscribe, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.